Hey there. Welcome to another deep dive into consciousness. If you're here, that must mean you're ready to move past those clickbait headlines and like really get into it.
Yeah, get into the nitty-gritty.
Exactly. And we've got a fascinating discussion to unpack straight from the 2023 Holberg Debate.
Oh, yeah, I love their work.
Three really, really big thinkers on this topic of consciousness, and they all have their own ideas about what consciousness is, where it comes from, even where it goes.
Yeah, they don't always agree either.
They really don't, and that's what makes it so interesting. So we've got Dr. Anil Seth, a neuroscientist, who basically says our perceptions are like controlled hallucinations that our brains are creating.
Which is a trip when you think about it.
It really is.
Yeah.
Then we've got Dr. Tanya Lurman. She's an anthropologist studying how spiritual practices can lead to these like really powerful experiences of God and spirits, even this idea that the mind is kind of porous and open to the world around it.
Right, like it's not all contained in our heads.
Exactly. And of course, no conversation on consciousness would be complete without Dr. Rupert Sheldrake.
Of course, got to have Sheldrake in there.
You know him, you love him. The biologist, famous for those really thought-provoking and sometimes controversial theories about morphic resonance.
Basically, the idea that your mind isn't confined to just your brain.
Right. So much to unpack there.
Yeah, where do we even begin with that?
Well, maybe we can start with a question we all ask ourselves at some point.
Okay, I'm game.
We've all had that feeling of like looking out at the world and it seems like there's a me behind our eyes somewhere just taking it all in.
Like a little person watching a movie.
Exactly. So is that what's actually happening? Is there like a miniature version of ourselves tucked away in our heads experiencing everything?
Oh, Dr. Seth would say absolutely not.
Really?
He calls this the homunculus problem.
The what problem?
The homunculus problem. Like imagine if there really was this tiny person inside your head watching your perceptions.
Okay.
Wouldn't that little person also need like a tiny version of themselves inside their head to process information?
I see where you're going with this.
It would just be endless. Like those Russian nesting dolls. Just little people all the way down.
So what's Seth's alternative then?
Well, he argues that instead of like a singular I, the self is more of a process that's constantly being constructed by the brain.
So it's not a thing, it's more of an action.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Just like our perception of the outside world is a process that's happening constantly. Our sense of self is too.
Okay, so if the self isn't this like single entity, then what is it? What's the alternative?
Well, that's where Dr. Luhrmann's research comes in and adds a really interesting layer to this.
Okay, I'm listening.
She argues that maybe it's not so much a single me, but more like a chorus of voices shaped by the people and the cultures that surround us.
Like all the different influences in our lives.
Right. Think about it for a second.
Hmm.
How much of who you are is shaped by your parents, by your friends, even by the books you read or the movies you watch?
Oh, wow. Yeah, I mean a lot probably when you think about it that way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Luhrmann's suggesting that all those influences leave a kind of imprint on our minds, and they shape how we see the world and even how we see ourselves.
So instead of a solo act, it's more of an ensemble performance.
Exactly. And just when you thought things couldn't get any weirder, Dr. Sheldrake takes us even further down this rabbit hole by asking, what if consciousness isn't even limited to the brain at all?
Wait, so our minds could actually be stretching beyond our skulls? Come on.
That's what he's proposing. Sheldrake points to those strange experiences we all have that are hard to explain scientifically. Things like premonitions or telepathy. Have you ever had those?
Oh, absolutely. Like knowing who's calling before you look at your phone.
Right, or that feeling of knowing someone's staring at you, even if you can't see them.
Oh my gosh, yes. I've totally had that feeling before.
And for Sheldrake, these aren't just flukes or coincidences, you know. He sees them as potential clues that our minds might be reaching beyond the physical limits of our bodies and interacting with the world in ways that we're just starting to understand.
Okay, now we're really getting into some mind-bending territory.
Or we're just getting started.
So if our minds can stretch beyond our brains, like what's the brain even doing in all of this?
Right, is it just like along for the ride?
Yeah.
Well, for Dr. Sheldrake, just focusing on the brain is like mistaking a radio for the music.
Okay.
He says the brain might not be the source of consciousness, but more like a receiver, you know, picking up on something way bigger than itself.
Okay. I'm going to need an example for this one because that's kind of out there.
Okay, how about this? Think about gravity for a second.
Okay.
We can't actually see gravity, right?
Yeah.
But we know it's there because we experience it, we feel its effects.
Yeah, that's true.
So Sheldrake believes our minds could work in a similar way, interacting with some kind of consciousness field that's like all around us.
Interesting. And there's something about vision, right? He uses that as an example too, doesn't he?
He does. It's called the extramission theory of vision. And it's a really cool example of how an old idea can really challenge our modern thinking, you know?
I'm all ears.
Basically, this theory says that we don't just like passively receive light with our eyes,
Yeah.
but we actually project something outward that lets us see.
Wait, so like how we explain mirrors to kids, that we're seeing light bouncing back at us.
Exactly. And that always seems like an oversimplification, right? But Sheldrake thinks there might be a deeper truth to it.
Okay.
He's saying this idea of vision being a two-way street of our minds, actually like interacting with the world around us, that could point to a way bigger picture of what consciousness is.
That's pretty wild. And then there's those cases of people with hydrocephalus.
Oh yeah, the brain stuff.
People who have way less brain matter than average, but some of them still live pretty normal lives.
Right. Fascinating cases.
So how does that fit into all of this if the brain is supposed to be so essential for consciousness?
It's a great question, and it really highlights how incredible the brain is, its adaptability, how resilient it can be, even with these huge challenges.
So the brain can basically work around those challenges.
In some cases, it seems like it is.
Yeah. But Dr. Seth would say we have to be careful about drawing big conclusions from just a few examples.
You're probably right.
He says while these cases are super interesting and need more study, they don't necessarily mean the brain isn't central to consciousness.
Okay, so where does that leave us?
Well, Seth sees them as evidence of what we call the brain's plasticity, its ability to adapt to change, even reorganize itself after damage, or in unusual circumstances.
So even though one case study might not like rewrite everything we know about neuroscience,
Right, it's not the be-all, end-all.
it raises some interesting questions about how much we really know about what the brain can do.
Exactly. And this is where the conversation gets even more interesting because it's not just about what we can see and measure scientifically, but also about the role of belief and our own experiences in understanding the world.
So like how our beliefs influence what we experience.
Exactly. And that brings us to Dr. Luhrmann's work.
So we've talked about the brain a lot, and even the idea that consciousness could exist outside the brain.
Right. But what about just the idea of belief and how that plays into all of this?
Yeah, that's a big one.
Dr. Luhrmann's research really gets into how our beliefs can actually shape our experiences in some really powerful ways.
Oh, absolutely. And it brings up those big questions, like what's real and what isn't.
Exactly.
Like Dr. Luhrmann's research has shown that if someone believes that God is present and speaking to them, they're much more likely to actually report hearing God's voice.
Wow.
So it makes you wonder, right, does that mean God is actually real out there in the world? Or is it something that the mind creates because of that belief?
It's such a fascinating question to think about. And Luhrmann doesn't shy away from the ethics of it all either, does she?
No, not at all.
If someone finds real comfort in that experience, the experience of a loving God.
Right.
Even if it's all in their head, even if it's a conjuring trick, as they say, does it really matter? Is it less real for them because of that?
That's what's so interesting about her work, right?
Yeah.
And Sheldrake takes it even a step further by suggesting that feeling that sense of awe and interconnectedness, even a belief in something divine.
Oh, okay.
He says that could actually be really crucial for how we deal with these big global problems like climate change.
So he's saying belief could actually lead to action.
Yeah. Basically, he seems to be saying that believing in something bigger than ourselves could be the key to changing our behavior on a larger scale.
Interesting. Which kind of goes against what Seth was saying earlier, right?
It does.
Seth acknowledges that belief is powerful, but he also warns about mistaking our own experiences for objective truth, right?
Right. He's all about that line between what's real for you and what's actually real.
Yeah, just because something feels real doesn't mean it exists outside of our own minds.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's what makes this whole discussion so fascinating.
It really does.
It's not about saying one person's right and the other one's wrong.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing that how we choose to understand consciousness, how we choose to even define it, has huge implications for how we live our lives, how we treat each other, how we deal with the future.
It really makes you think, if we could create conscious AI someday, would that AI need to believe in God in order to really understand the world?
Whoa.
Would it have to invent its own version of God based on its experiences?
Now, those are some questions, the kind of questions we should all be asking ourselves.
Absolutely. We are going to be sure to link to the full Holberg debate and all of the speakers' work in the show notes so you can check it out for yourselves.
Yeah, definitely do that.
Such a fascinating conversation about consciousness. Always so much to think about.
Always more questions than answers.
That's the best. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the mind. And until next time, keep those brain cells firing.